Hey everyone, thanks for your time. There were two big announcements this past week, and there's a lot of ground to cover. There's plenty to think about with both, but these are new rabbit holes to dig down into, so this video is just the beginning of the analysis. We were expecting an announcement about the Orion base heat shield investigation sometime this month, but the nomination of Jared Isaacman to be the next NASA administrator was a surprise to see during the transition period, which is much earlier than typical. So let's go ahead and start to dig into this new information. On Thursday, December 5th, top NASA leadership held a press conference at the space agency's headquarters in Washington, D.C. The Orion heat shield investigation process was finally concluded with the elements of a report presented to NASA leadership. That included the findings like the root cause and recommendations about what corrective actions to take. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson accepted the unanimous recommendation to fly the Artemis II crewed lunar flyby mission with the existing Orion base heat shield and to make changes to all future heat shields. The investigation itself had to go down its own set of rabbit holes, and it took longer to complete. Even with the conclusion of the investigation, though, Artemis II Orion spacecraft assembly and test is also running long. NASA approved continuing with stacking the Artemis II SLS vehicle now, but Orion launch readiness drove the overall launch readiness date from September 2025 to April 2026. The Artemis III launch date was also moved out from September 2026 to mid-2027. It's not completely clear if that date is the soonest that Orion and SLS could fly, or whether Starship HLS and the Axiom EVA suits could also support that. Orion performed a skip re-entry when it returned from the Moon on December 11, 2022, at the end of the Artemis I mission. NASA published a piece on the investigation findings, and that described the root cause of the unexpected char loss. It says, quote, "Engineers determined as Orion was returning from its uncrewed mission around the Moon, gases generated inside the heat shield's ablative outer material called avcoat were not able to vent and dissipate as expected. This allowed pressure to build up and cracking to occur, causing some charred material to break off in several locations," unquote. The piece also noted that the investigation team, quote, "observed that during the period between dips into the atmosphere, heating rates decreased and thermal energy accumulated inside the heat shield's avcoat material. This led to the accumulation of gases that are part of the expected ablation process. Because the avcoat did not have the permeability, internal pressure built up and led to cracking and uneven shedding of the outer layer," unquote. NASA leadership went over the Orion base heat shield investigation and more in the press conference on December 5th. Here are some initial thoughts and takeaways from that. First is kind of outside the press conference, because hanging over all of this is the news of the nomination of Jared Isaacman and the continuing reports of big changes when President Trump starts his second term in mid-January. NASA Deputy Administrator Pam Melroy noted in the press conference that NASA had not interacted with any transition people.
To the greatest extent possible, we certainly want to defer any decisions about starting or ending programs. Major decisions need to be deferred for a new team, and we have not yet received a transition team, so we didn't have an opportunity to brief anybody. But I just want to emphasize, we're on a day-for-day slip. We had to make this decision. And if you're waiting for a new administrator to be confirmed and a team to come up to speed on all this technical work that we've all been tracking very closely, I think that would actually be far worse to defer it and hand a 5 to 6 months delay. It was pretty clear that we needed to go forward.
So proceeding down this road leaves all options open for the new administration, either the Artemis missions on the new schedule or the reset of the overall program that is rumored. Next, I was wondering about the progress of Artemis II Orion assembly and test, and NASA leadership acknowledged that is taking longer. Rather than this decision, the assembly and test schedule seems to be the critical path, and that may have played a part in the pace of deliberations on the heat shield investigation. If Orion final assembly was to take until March, for example, NASA had that much more time to make the decisions they did on Thursday. In terms of the Orion investigation findings, there had been some mention of the char loss occurring during the pull-up period of the re-entry profile, but it was interesting to see that the skip re-entry profile played a role in the behavior seen. In that piece that NASA published on their investigation findings, they also noted that determining root cause required developing new testing techniques in order to reproduce the conditions during the pull-up or skip. It was also interesting to hear a historical overview of the AVCOAT formulation from Amit Kshatriya.
A couple things. First was when we moved, we've used the AVCOAT formulation over the years. The spec was generated during Apollo. The Apollo spec was different. It had some environmentally sensitive materials that we can't use anymore, and that specification was handed over from multiple companies, from AVCO to Textron to Lockheed Martin, and then into the Orion program. It also was flowed into the Constellation program, and then when it was shut down, a lot of that knowledge was lost too. And so there was a lot of kind of dissolution of the understanding of how to formulate the material. Also, the material subtly changed.
There was also more clarity on the switch from the Apollo design with the honeycomb that held the hundreds of thousands of cells the AVCOAT was injected into. That honeycomb fit over a carrier structure, which is still part of the design. Here's how the switch to the large blocks of AVCOAT material over the carrier structure was described in the press conference.
One thing Apollo did differently and continued to do was they recognized that this spallation phenomenon was important. They also recognized that if you lost that material, which they did, I don't have the exact corporate memory, but even during Mercury Gemini 2, that this is something they were worried about. What they did to arrest that problem during Apollo is they, instead of using the block geometry that we have on Orion, they used a honeycomb material over the carrier structure on the heat shield. And so that honeycomb, it essentially was a titanium honeycomb, and that basically provided mechanical separation between the different parts of the ablative material. So you could crack and you could spall, but it wouldn't propagate across the acreage. The formulation of that and the manufacturing of that was extremely tedious. It took a lot of very, very kind of highly skilled, very sort of minute labor, and the Apollo had an industrial base. The country had an industrial base that could do that kind of work. We tried to do that on EFT-1. That's exactly the formulation we did. But because of the changes in the material and also because of the size of the Orion acreage, it turns out that the way the structure was flexing and all sorts of other things just made that application process extremely difficult. So they were able to do it for EFT-1. But after that, they decided it's too challenging. Let's see if we can use the advanced analytical techniques and other things we've developed since then to go to an easier manufacturing geometry. But then let's go work on what that looks like in terms of its interaction with the environment. So that is kind of the traceability from Apollo to today.
Another takeaway was that the NASA Exploration Directorate believes they can handle the SLS solid rocket booster stacking clock similarly to Artemis I. But this was the first time that strategy was suggested in public. Previously, they were talking about that clock as a larger consideration. A longer stacking clock would give NASA more flexibility to mitigate schedule risks from stacking SLS tanking tests, and EGS launch team turnover while, so to speak, waiting for Orion to be ready to stack. The new April 2026 target date is largely based on the Orion schedule, which means that the spacecraft is not likely to be ready to stack for the better part of 2025. If the Artemis II boosters can be stacked for as long as the Artemis I boosters, that would allow EGS to have more time for quote-unquote debugging of the SLS stack and the changes to the mobile launcher and Launch Pad 39B infrastructure before Orion is ready to stack on top of SLS. Mr. Kshatriya noted that those measurements of the slump of the propellant in the segments were being taken now, and that if they haven't slumped yet, that would mean a longer stacking clock to begin with.
For stack life extension, you can do that in real time incrementally over time, because what you can do is measure the slump in the booster to see if that propellant migration potential is there. If you don't see any slump, you get an automatic extension of the life. And for Artemis I, as you pointed out, we extended it well out past 12 months. We think pretty easily we can get to 18 months, generally just based on historical understanding. We started slump measurements just last week, so we knew that clock. So we have a good baseline for what that clock is going to be. And then even if we went longer, there are ways to mitigate that concern by controlling the launch temperature if we have to go there. Now, fortunately, our production on the booster side is also excellent. So if it turns out that we have a real issue, we would consider that potentially shipping the other boosters from the railhead in Utah and having those, but that would be an extensive kind of restacking operation. We're not even close to that. I believe we can get between 18 and 24 months pretty comfortably.
The focus of the press conference was on Artemis II, but the Artemis III date was also reset to mid-2027. However, the uncertainty about how the programs meet even that delayed schedule is still there. NASA really can't speak for SpaceX when it comes to Starship, and there's no new flight test schedule available for that. In fact, Mr. Kshatriya cited a Starship schedule that sounds old, similar to a recent interview where the propellant transfer demonstration was scheduled for March. So the broader Starship outlook remains cloudy. For Artemis III, mid-2027 gives everyone more time, but it remains to be seen how much margin that gives not just Orion and SLS, but also Axiom and Starship HLS. Mr. Kshatriya also noted some issues with development of the Axiom lunar surface spacesuits.
On the suit side, I guess Axiom's doing a great job. We've been to their factory recently. They have a great production line. We have a pretty good command of the technology that's needed to make the suit work. It is a very difficult qualification problem and a manufacturing problem. That's very tight geometry. The reliability standards that are levied on a suit like that is really challenging to meet, but they have some of the best experts in the world. A lot of them came from the agency and are helping them internal, and also we have tremendous insight there. So they've got some challenges, I think, but so far they've been very open with us about what they need, and we're working with them really well. But getting that life support system done, principally for the suit, and in particular, there are some very unique components, high pressure oxygen regulators, et cetera, that we're really struggling with. Again, I mentioned earlier that our supply chains are so fragile, and a lot of these, the specifications on some of these components are so rigid, and they're rigid for a reason, because of the reliability requirements that are needed. They're just hard to build, and we used to be able to build, a lot of different entities used to be able to build these types of components, and we are running out of industry that can do that, and so that's become a pacing item on that side.
I had mentioned a few times that an Artemis III flight crew was expected to be announced within 18 months to 2 years prior to the targeted launch date. With the delay to the target date, we're again outside that window. However, that would correspond to about this time next year, which isn't that far away. It just means that we'll be continuing to closely watch all the Artemis III programs for any information about schedules and forward outlook. There were more details in the press conference, like the question I asked about the relationship between re-entry trajectory constraints for Artemis II and launch availability, and there are more questions to follow up on afterwards, so hopefully I can catch up on all that pretty soon. Going back to the day before, on Wednesday, December 4th, President Trump nominated Jared Isaacman to be the next NASA administrator after he is confirmed by the Senate next year. As I noted earlier, this can be seen as overshadowing the technical and programmatic details discussed the next day in the press conference because of the wide expectation of significant changes planned for some of the Artemis programs once Trump's second term begins on January 20th. At the very least, it seems to be a strong signal that the government-run space programs will be under new scrutiny from the incoming team. The timing of the nomination is also unusual. NASA administrator nominations rarely come before a new president takes over control. So this is also signaling that NASA policy is a relatively high priority for those coming into power. Given the report from Pam Melroy that a transition team hadn't yet interacted with the current NASA administration, it wouldn't be surprising if Isaacman oversees the transition and the speedy nomination gives him time to hit the proverbial ground running. Having said that, we are still seeing mostly rumors and possible trial balloons being floated in public. We'll see whether there is any declaration or statement on public record before Elon Musk and Isaacman take over control that they plan to terminate any of the government-run Artemis programs, from SLS and EGS to Orion and Gateway. It's natural for people to look ahead, and one of the rumors that branches off of the main rumor about the SLS program being terminated on Capitol Hill is that Orion would then need a new launch vehicle. If that were the path that Congress were to allow the Trump administration to take, it's definitely feasible to fly Orion in an Earth orbit rendezvous architecture. That's what the lunar version was originally designed towards in Constellation. A launch vehicle would put Orion in low Earth orbit, and then there would be a rendezvous and docking with an Earth departure stage that was launched separately. Orion can be modified to integrate with another launch vehicle, and another launch vehicle can be modified to fly Orion. It's not a question of whether that's possible. It is possible. The questions are about when that's possible and how much that would cost. As noted in the post-election video I released last month, SLS will be the fastest way to get Orion to the moon on Artemis II and Artemis III, because the Artemis II SLS vehicle is done. It could have flown this year. The next vehicle is now over halfway through production and is on a pace that would support a hypothetical Orion launch in mid-2027. Terminating SLS and integrating Orion with another launch vehicle wouldn't support even the new delayed Artemis II and III target dates, and one of the questions would be how long it would take, which would vary depending on the new launch vehicle. So big picture, terminating SLS would need to be important enough to trade that short-term pain of a further delay to Artemis II and III for the long-term gain of recouping the SLS wedge of the budget pie. But related to that, though, is the question, will NASA get to keep the SLS budget and reprogram it? If DOGE is trying to reduce spending, that multi-billion-dollar savings would have to be passed to the taxpayers. And there's also the question about how long that delay will be and how much it will cost. The Orion program has been flat funded since its near-death experience in 2010, which is part of the reason why the service module and crew systems and support capabilities were delayed for so long. If the government wants to expedite integrating the crew-rated Orion with another launch vehicle, which would also need to be crew-rated, more money up front would be needed. Otherwise, if the flat funding approach were to continue, it will take longer to integrate Orion with another launch vehicle. Starship will no longer be the critical path for Artemis III. That would quickly become Orion. There's also the questions of how soon a launch vehicle could be selected and Orion modifications could start. How long would a procurement competition selection process take? And how soon could a budget increase happen? If SLS is terminated, the existing contracts will need to be bought out by the government. That will tie up money for fiscal year 2026 and future years, depending on whether those termination costs are spread out or not. The time versus money trade-offs would apply there unless supplemental Orion budget increases can be arranged. One of the differences between 2019, when this idea was considered very narrowly for a single mission use, is that the Orion design is now fully crew-rated. In this hypothetical, the selected launch vehicle provider would also have to spend some money to crew-rate their launcher and to integrate it with Orion. Presumably, since the government is the customer for that, the government will also have to pay for that. Given all the cancellation rumors, we'll have to wait and see whether SLS is being targeted and also whether it's the only program being targeted. But the matchmaking for Orion is also likely to be something we return to again. Hopefully there will be some technical and programmatic detail to help determine how expensive it would be and how many years it will take. Perhaps the bigger picture question here is why the powers that be would do this. Is it to fly Artemis III without SLS as soon as possible, or something else? Putting Orion on another launch vehicle is feasible, but it's not about whether it's realistic. It's about whether the assumptions and expectations are realistic about how long and how expensive it will be to do. Given the baggage that SLS has, being the argument for terminating it, Orion on something else might be better, but it might not be cheaper in the short run, and it won't necessarily be faster. If the new administration is going to reset Artemis, maybe it makes sense to also think about what the goals are, not just this decade, but farther into the future. Taking a look at the big picture now, for Artemis II, NASA decided to proceed with the existing Orion base heat shield and approved continuing with vehicle integration. But there's two things happening at the same time with that. Exploration Ground Systems is now approved to assemble the SLS vehicle, finishing the other 8 segments of the boosters, then the forward assemblies to top those out, then the 2 liquid propellant stages, and the adapter in between. But as we wondered, the Orion schedule has stretched out. It might not be ready to stack with SLS until around this time next year or thereabouts. They were projecting about 3 to 4 months to stack SLS, which would be a quote-unquote short stack. But the launcher would then need to be connected to all the SLS umbilicals on the mobile launcher, and the integrated SLS would then be powered up and run through its integrated test and checkout. Then it would be possible for EGS to roll the vehicle out to Launch Pad 39B for a tanking test campaign, and there would be a lot of details to wonder about there. It sounds like that decision to do an SLS-only tanking test is not a done deal yet. NASA Administrator Senator Bill Nelson said they were going to try to launch Artemis II sooner than April 2026, and what's important about that in 2025 is whether the Orion program, prime contractor Lockheed Martin, and Exploration Ground Systems can get the spacecraft ready to be stacked on SLS sooner than later. Once Lockheed Martin completes final assembly and test of the spacecraft, they will hand Orion over to the EGS Spacecraft and Offline Operations team, who will take it to the multi-payload processing facility to be loaded with propellants and fluids. Then Orion would move to the Launch Abort System facility for the Launch Abort System to be stacked on top of and encapsulate the crew module. Readiness to launch will be driven by that work for a good part of next year, and again, the sooner that Orion is ready to be stacked on SLS, the sooner Artemis II would be ready to launch. For Artemis III, NASA delayed that target date to mid-2027. During the press conference, NASA Associate Administrator Jim Free said that they still have the goal of flying Artemis III around 15 to 18 months after Artemis II, which is an adjustment to the previous and approximate 12-month goal. But aside from that, there's not as much information to factor into the outlook for the mission, and so the outlook doesn't change that much, since we're on the outside. There are still major production milestones for Orion and SLS ahead next year, and there are major development milestones for Starship HLS and the Axiom EMU. And we still don't have that much information to go on. It's still unclear whether the programs are catching up, falling behind, or something else. So now one of the major Artemis flight tests has been delayed out of 2025. That's Artemis II. It's still an open question whether the other one, the dual-launch Starship propellant transfer demonstration, will also be delayed past 2025. And of course, all of this could be rendered moot in 2 months or so, depending on the intentions of the incoming Trump team, led by Elon Musk and Jared Isaacman. As an aside, Jim Free would become acting NASA administrator until Isaacman is confirmed by the Senate. But we'll see how that goes in January too. Thanks for watching. Click on the like button if you found this video informative. Hopefully I'll be able to do more of these this month, but there's a lot of stuff going on here at home, and also there could be some media events and some other things going on, and December has gotten a lot busier than sort of expected. So stay tuned. I'll try and keep everybody up to date. But there does seem to be a lot of Artemis stuff that's going to be going on in December.